Hello everyone, this is MMA Sherdog for the Bluff the Spot High Stakes course. In this video, I'm going to cover 3-bet pots out of position as the caller. These spots are much more difficult to figure out than 3-bet pots out of position as the 3-better because we just called a 3-bet, so our range is far behind in equity and we do not have the initiative. So it's important that we look into how to play these spots and avoid disasters in big pots out of position. So first, some pre-flop pointers. Most importantly, be tight when you're out of position. Do not call too many 3-bets out of position. What will happen is that you will end up calling a lot and then you'll have to just fold the flop, or you'll check raise and fold, or you go call, fold, and your opponent will basically run you over with aggression. So fold a lot of 3-bets. That means we have few flat calls and we do 4-bet a lot. If we don't 4-bet enough, then we don't punish in position for 3-betting. So worst case scenario, he 3-bets a weak hand, like let's say ace-10 offsuit or ace-5 suited or 5-4 suited, and he gets to realize a lot of equity by seeing the flop and often the turn and the river. So make sure to make your opponent pay for 3-betting by 4-betting a wide and somewhat depolarized range. When you are deep stacked, you want to focus more on hands that can make the nuts. So hands like suited aces, suited connectors, and any type of hand that can make the nuts goes up in value. Hands like ace-queen offsuit or ace-jack offsuit, king-queen offsuit, they go way down in value. Let's say we 4-bet out of position with ace-queen, 200 big blinds deep. Oftentimes you'll just flop a gut shot with no backdoor flush draw, or you bet and you get raised and you'll be potentially calling with a hand that cannot really improve to the nuts. So look to play more hands which have nut making ability. When you're short stacked, the opposite happens. Hands like ace-queen are far more powerful at 40 big blinds than at 200 big blinds. A hand like pocket threes goes way down in value because let's say you call a 3-bet out of position 40 big blinds deep and you flop a set, you don't really have much in terms of implied odds. On to the flop. This first bullet point is perhaps the most important tip. Your fundamentals on each board do not change if this scenario changes. So let's say we are button versus cutoff in a 3-bet pot out of position. We play sort of the same as blind versus blind out of position. We have a range which is behind an equity, and good boards for in position are good in every single spot, which means they are bad for us. The medium boards, like let's say 5, 6, 7, are good for us in every single spot. So if you know how to play, let's say blind versus blind out of position, you also know how to play button versus cutoff out of position. We're going to look into all of that in a second in Pile Solver. When we check raise the flop, we tend to check raise somewhat depolarized when we check raise a wide range. So the boards on which in position c-bets a lot, we will also usually check raise a lot. There's also boards which are very bad for you and you do not want to check raise them at a high frequency. So when you do, you tend to be very polarized and use a larger sizing. Similar to pre-flop play, you should not call too many bets on the flop. So we are folding relatively often out of position and we are check raising relatively often. I'm sure you guys have all gone on tilt before when you started calling a lot of 3-bets out of position and then you call the flop but you don't have that much EV, and on the turn you turn a gut shot and you side call, on the river you fold, and then people just keep on doing that over and over and over again, and you just feel like you're getting milked out of position. That is the type of scenario which you want to avoid. You should also mix it up. If you are unpredictable, then your opponent often doesn't know what you're up to, which means he'll slow down. And when he has the stronger range in position, you want him to slow down. So sometimes when you have the nuts, you want to check, or you want to use a line which is a bit unconventional. So your opponent has to be worried at all times. If you always show up with the hands you're supposed to show up with, then he can bet with impunity and not have to be worried at all. So let's go into some sims and look at different types of check calling and check raising strategies. So the first sim I'm going to show you is a7-3 rainbow, and I would like to point out what I said at the beginning of the flop slide, that the fundamentals of your flop strategy do not change when positions change. So you see that in position, C bets 84% on a7-3 in a 3-bet pot blind versus blind. Obviously, this is a very good board frame position, as the ace is better for him. The 7 and the 3 are kind of irrelevant, and it's hard for out of position to have anything else, because the best he can have is 5-4 suited for the double gut shot. Now, a similar example, button versus cutoff, a7-3 rainbow. You see the same thing. In the first sim, we're c-betting 84%. In the second sim, 89%. So virtually the same. So you see that good boards, blind versus blind, are also good button versus cutoff, or button versus under the gun, or cutoff versus under the gun, etc., etc. So let's stick to button cutoff for now and see how in position plays. Most people tend to c-bet their entire range on a board like this, so we're going to use a sim in which Pile Solver does that. So let's look at out of position strategy. Against a full range 1/4 pot bet, a tiny bet, out of position is still folding at around 45%. So in position we'll make tons of money just based on fold equity. So you see, we're only calling 28% of the time, mostly with the obvious hands. Hands like, let's say, ace-10 suited. A hand which is a little bit weak to check raise, at least at a high frequency. We're still check raising sometimes, but obviously way too strong to be check folding. And we're calling some hands like 10s for the same reason. Way too strong to fold, but far too weak to check raise. And also it doesn't really have any type of backup equity where we could potentially turn our hand into a bluff, let's say. Let's look at check raises then. A hand like 6-7 suited performs somewhat similarly to a hand like 10s. Obviously we're losing to 8s and 9s now, and 7-8. But the hand strength is not that different. The main difference is that with 6-7, you need even more protection, and also you have better backup equity. So we're check raising hands like second pair plus backup for protection on the flop, and then when the turn is good for us, we turn our hand into a bluff. It's also a nice hand to, for instance, check raise and then check on the turn. And when the river is really good for us, we can check raise, check, and then bluff. We're occasionally check raising some other hands with backdoors, like 6-5 suited, for instance, with the backdoor flush draw. Obviously, when we have the backdoor flush draw, we'll be check raising more often than when we do not. So you can see right here with 6-5 of hearts, we're check raising far less often than with the backdoor flush draw combos. And you'll see, for instance, that 6-5 of spades gets check raised a little bit less often because we don't block ace-5 of spades now in imposition shoes, and that is a hand that imposition does tend to 3-bet. We do not care about blocking a6 offsuit, for instance, because obviously imposition doesn't 3-bet a6 offsuit. So you see right here, nutty hands like pocket 7s tend to get check raised. Some type of top pairs with good kickers. So you see it's very intuitive right here. Top pair with our best kicker, ace-queen, gets check raised. And then the weaker our kicker, the less likely it is that we do check raise. So I think that makes a lot of sense. And then our backdoors get check raised, as well as some of the mergey hands. But all in all, the most important thing to note is the fact that we're folding so often against the small bet. Let's look at a different board on which in position c-bets a lot, yet we do not check raise that much. So here we got King Jack 4 Again, I'm not going to cover imposition strategy too much. If you want to know more about that, you have to check out the 3bet pots imposition video. So on this board, we're also c-betting range. Pie solver c-betting near 100%. So I simplified it. So we c-bet 100% on the flop. And now we're still folding somewhere in the mid 40s, 43%. But instead of check raising in the mid 20s, we're only check raising about 11% now. And this is a board on which you don't want to go with the smaller check raise, because the hands that we are representing for value want to check raise large. So you see right here, we are check raising sometimes with our big draws, like let's say Queen 10 of hearts, Ace 10 of hearts, with our occasional nutted hands like King Queen. And you see the same thing applies where King Queen gets check raised somewhat often, but then King 10 and King 9 do not. You'll also see that the underpairs get folded because not only do they block bluffs, they have very little equity. Because if villain has a king or a jack, you have two outs. So on this board, out of position just has almost no EV. And then you see that, for instance, hands like Ace Queen, which have somewhat reasonable showdown value, we tend to just call with. And then when we have a weaker draw, we tend to even fold. A hand like 10 unsuited, let's say. So you see that out of position's EV in this spot is only 36, whereas in position's EV is 182. That's pretty insane. So yeah, on these boards, just be tight. There's unfortunately not much we can do. Sometimes it just happens. We were behind pre-flop, and now this board improves in position even more than us, so we're just way behind. So don't go crazy on these types of boards. Let's look at a board which is much better for us than King Jack 4. So Jack 8-6 is much better for out of position than King Jack 4. We have two sets now, pocket 8s and pocket 6s. We have more high equity hands, such as 10-9, Queen 10, more flush draws, more overcards. In position may not have pocket 6s, so we can fight back a lot more on this board, which is reflected in the imposition strategy. It's c-betting nowhere near 100%. There is different strategies you can use here. Again, if you want to know more about those, check out the imposition 3bet pot video. So in position, c-bets half pot here, and you see we're check raising more often now, and we are also folding more often. And you might say, well, 16% is still less than 23 from the first example, and we're still folding in the high 30s. That's not insanely aggressive, and that's true. But remember that in position here is not c-betting its whole range, and we're c-betting 50% pot, whereas in the other example, we were c-betting only 25% pot. So against double the bet size, we're still much more aggressive. And you'll see that the same concepts apply. Nutted hands like 8s and 6s mostly get raised, but you also want to call them sometimes. Remember the last bullet point, make sure to mix it up. If you check call a hand like this sometimes, when villain bets big on a blank turn, which we'll get into in a second, you can check raise. And then villain may think, okay, you would have check raised almost all of your good hands on the flop. This is a very draw heavy range. I will call off light. And then you get it in with possibly 100% equity. So we check raise our very strongest hands. You see again, ace jack suited gets check raised quite often, but then a slightly weaker jack does not get check raised as often. You'll see that nutted draws get check raised often, and like ace 5 of hearts sometimes. So we have an overcard and a nut flush draw, and we also unblock all of villain's air. So if villain were to shove with a hand like queen 10 of hearts, we would get it in very well. You'll see that ace queen of hearts gets check raised far less often because the queen is a relatively clean out. On the queen, we usually have the best hand, whereas on a 5, we rarely do. So we'll get pushed off our equity much more easily. You'll see that obvious hands again get check called. On a7-3, we were check calling pocket 10s basically always. You see right here, 10s, 9s, we're check calling them most of the time. It's just the perfect medium strength hand to be check calling. The one major difference here is that we are not check raising as many of the backdoors. So you see right here, a hand like 6-7 would be a nice candidate to check raise, you would think, but on these types of boards, it doesn't. Whereas on the dry boards, it does. So if you find all these little patterns, you'll play every board right. We're also going to cover a 5-6-7 flush draw board, which is so good for out of position that in position checks back its full range. So we'll be covering that hand from the turn onwards. Now on to the turn. So we're going to be facing different turn sizes, and obviously we have to then counter those sizes with different strategies. So you'll see that on blank cards or cards that are good for imposition, they tend to bet larger with a wider range. Whereas if the card is bad for them, they tend to be much more passive. So we're going to look into how to counter these different sizes on different types of boards. Obviously on a7-3, we're going to play significantly differently than on jack 8-6. Turn play after the flop check raise is also important. You saw that on the flop, we're check raising at a fairly high frequency other than on the king jack 4 board. So what do we do on the turn? On the flop, we check raised a bunch of decent hands that weren't necessarily the nuts, but were still pretty good. For instance, top pair, medium kicker. What do we do on the turn? On boards in which imposition has a check back range, we can have polarizing turn leads. We generally lead up polarized when the board is pretty safe for us, but when we rep a narrow value range. So if villain checks back his pretty decent hands, you want to lead out better than that. So you're saying my hand is better than decent, which makes you want to bet large. Whereas if your opponent just checks back a lot of, let's say, ace highs, king highs that he's going to fold, or lots of no equity hands, then you may want to lead out really small to just clear out a bit of equity and give yourself a cheap price to steal a pot. So back to a7-3, in position c-bets range, out of position calls, we turn a jack, we check our full range as out of position, and you'll see that I've allowed pile solver to bet third pot in position as well as 2/3 pot, and you see it clearly prefers the larger bet. So you see it bets with a somewhat polarized range for a larger sizing. The jack is really not that scary. Out of position has ace jack sometimes. It still has some aces, but other than that, it doesn't really improve because we don't have jack 7. We don't have hands like ace king, let's say. We don't have hands like 10-9 even that can now have a gut shot. So imposition is doing very well on these boards. So when we bet larger, you'll see that out of position is basically never check raising. So we can check raise all in, which we never do. And we check raise 3% of the time, which we can almost ignore. So I would not hate if you guys just choose not to check raise. So you see the flop is great, the turn is great for imposition, and he's betting big. He's saying, I got a very good hand or I got nothing. So then you generally don't want to fast play. There's not that many cards on which you would want to fast play, because think about it. Which card is really good for us as out of position? A 5 would give us more equity than a jack. But if I were to pick a 5, even one that brings the flush draw, you'll see imposition bets big even more often. And we're still barely check raising around 4% of the time. So imposition uses the same polarized c-bet strategy, and we just tend to check call or check fold. Because what does imposition have to worry about here? You know, 4-5 has decent amount of equity, sure, but it hasn't improved. Out of position doesn't have pocket 5s often. As you can see, we would have often check raised the flop or check folded. So we in position bets with a strong range, which means we can just play check call or check fold, and we're still folding at a decent frequency, 40%. That's not a ton, but remember that we already folded a decent amount pre-flop and we folded a decent amount on the flop. So we get to this turn with a somewhat tight range and we're still folding 40%. So what do we do after the flop check raise? You see that we check raise quite often on a dry board like this for a smaller sizing, and in position calls, and then on, let's say, a 9, you'll see that we're still betting quite often because in position doesn't improve too much on the 9, maybe pocket 9s, maybe ace 9, but that's about it. You'll maybe ask yourself, why are we only betting a third pot? And the reason is that the pot is already so big that if we were to bet third pot, we can still easily get the money in by the river. If you were very deep, then you would have to size up. So this card is not necessarily bad for us, which means we keep on betting a lot. And you'll see that out of position will also continue to bet a lot after the check raise, because which card is really bad for out of position? Maybe a king. I'm showing you a queen here, which is one of the better cards for in position, because in position is always bet calling queens and always bet calling ace queen offsuit, which means in position has a lot of ace queens here, and we're still betting quite often, you see? So if the king and the queen are not that bad for us, how can any other card really be that bad? If we pick an 8, you'll see we're betting even more, because the 8 improves some of our mergier check raises, and it doesn't improve in position as much as the queen. So on any card that doesn't hurt you too much, we keep on betting somewhat often. If the card is very bad for you, we tend to check more, which I'm going to show you in the next example. So on King Jack 4, first we're going to look at how to play various turns, and then I'll show you how to play after check raising the flop. So first we call the flop, and on the clean turn, you'll see that in position bets at a high frequency. And here now we're fast playing more often than on the a7-3 turn X. The reason is that this board is quite draw heavy, so fast playing becomes more important. If this were a rainbow board, we would check raise less often, because in position is going to be betting many flush draws or pairs plus draws very often, as well as pair plus straight draws. So when the board is a bit more wet, you check raise more often. This was a very clean turn though. Let's pick a card which is a bit more scary, or a lot more scary. A 10 of hearts. So you see that in position is now betting very little, and then out of position can therefore call more, because in position is forced to bet small, so out of position is getting better odds. And then we also get to check raise if we like. And we don't have to check raise all in here, we can still check raise small. So here you see that we're mostly check raising with our stronger hands, like let's say 8-7 of hearts, and then we're mostly check calling with our medium hands, like let's say Jack 10. And then we can also turn some hands into a bluff. You see, for instance, a hand like pocket 9s gets turned into a bluff occasionally. And just to cover check calls quickly, so we bet larger here, and you'll see that it check calls somewhat intuitively. You can't fold a king here. A king is near the top of your range, so you see right here the strongest king sometimes gets check raised, but at this point in position is representing a much more polarized range than on the flop, so your hand is less valuable. And we've already eliminated some of our king queens on the flop because we check raised. So we're check raising sometimes, but not that often, and then the weaker kings always get check called. And you see that most of the jacks get check called for the same reason, as in we are too high up in our range to be check folding. Especially hands like, let's say, ace jack, because they block ace king, they block jacks, they block aces. And we can fold some of the weaker hands, like let's say the under pairs that we sometimes called on the flop, as well as some of the medium draws like ace queen. A hand like ace five of hearts now gets check called because we have a pair. Pious Solver does not like check raising this hand too often, which is somewhat surprising. I think that intuitively actually makes a bit of sense, but it doesn't like it in this hand. The reason is that you would get in position to fold a few better hands and a lot of hands with equity, and your hand has pretty decent equity no matter what. A hand like 5-4 suited obviously gets check raised because you have a hand which is almost always ahead, but basically any river sucks. So you'd want to get the money in now when you know your hand is still ahead. On to example number 3, Jack 8-6. So I picked a 3 of diamonds turn, which is a blank, sort of. The flush draw obviously is relevant, but the 3 itself is not. So you see in position tends to bet large again on the safe cards. And you see that because there's so many bluffs in position's range, we do less folding. An 8 is looking a lot better here because it's actually difficult for in position to have better. 10s and 9s mostly get checked in his shoes, so he has to have a good jack or better in order for an 8 to be beat. It also means we check raise a bit more often than on an a7-3 board. It's a similar frequency to the king jack 4 board. On that board we check raise 7%, here around 6. And you see the same things apply. Top pair good kicker gets check raised sometimes, basically for a tiny bit of value as well as protection. Obviously, I know that villain can easily just snap call queens plus here, but getting it in against some weaker value hands sometimes and getting protection against bluffs is very important. Because if you have ace jack here, unless the river is a board pair that does not complete the flush, you're in big trouble. So you want to get the money in now when you know you're still doing somewhat well. You see that, again, the nutted hands mostly get check raised. We eliminated most of them on the flop, and now we eliminate most of them on the turn. But you still have them sometimes. And then we're check raising sometimes with the stronger draws. So you see right here, a hand like ace-5 of hearts now does get check raised. But a hand like queen-10 of hearts, not really. And the reason is that, so this is a very important tip. Be careful that you don't go all in with a dominated draw. In PLO, this is even more important than a no limit, but it still really hurts you if here in position calls the turn all in with, let's say, a better flush draw with an ace kicker as well. Then you're almost drawing dead. So you see queen 10 of hearts easily has enough equity to check call. We have potentially queen and potentially a 10 as an out. We have a gotcha to the nuts, and we have a flush draw. And then obviously we're folding with our weaker draws, like let's say 10-9 with no flush draw. And queen 10 and 10-9 of hearts are basically the same. With the 10-9 of hearts we have an open ender, but now we don't have the queen, which would have been a better out than the 9. So what about 5, 6, 7? We're going to introduce that board now. So again, check out the imposition play video to learn more about the flop strategy. So imposition checks back their full range. So let's look at some turns. On some turns we'll be leading polarized, and on some turns we'll lead out depolarized. So let's pick an ace. On an ace, we are checking a lot, which makes sense because that's probably the best card for imposition. Because imposition is going to have all aces, ace kings, ace queens, some hands like ace 5, hands like ace high flush draws. So we're checking often, and when we lead very big. I think that makes a lot of sense because you're basically saying, I have your ace king beat already. And if you have ace king beat, you're repping a very polarized range. So you see, we are mostly leading with our nutted hands like sets and the straight, but we're sometimes checking as well for deception, because imposition can stab this board a lot on the turn, so we get to check raise him. And then next time he has a hand like ace queen, he'll think twice about betting because he's afraid of you. Whereas if you never check raise him, then he can just bet. Then, you know, worst case scenario, you check call him with a better hand, and then he just checks back the river, and then you don't win a big pot. So mostly leading out our nutted hands, and mostly leading out with our big draws. Let's say a hand like 10-9 of hearts, because we have a nut gut shot as well as a flush draw. You'll see that some of the high cards get checked. With a hand like king queen, you still beat some of the weaker in position hands like jack 10, and we don't really have that much equity because we're dominated against hands like ace king and ace queen. So usually we just check those and hope to realize a little bit of equity. But obviously the EV of these hands is fairly low. What about a safer card? On d5, we're leading out much more often now, and we're often using a small sizing. The 5 doesn't really hit in position much unless he has exactly ace-5 or some 5-4 combos. And the same goes for us. So now we're much more interested in just protection betting a thinner range and sometimes using a bigger bet, because you may want to build a very big pot when you do have the nuts and you still have all of those good hands. So there's two approaches here. The first is to just only lead small, which means you can lead out a bit more often, which simplifies your strategy and means that your bet sizes will not become a tell as easily. The downside is that you're going to be missing value with the top end of your range, which definitely hurts you because obviously you want to win your opponent's entire stack. And then obviously the second approach is to have both sizes, which is higher in EV, but much more complicated to execute. So I don't necessarily feel too strongly here. I would personally use two sizes, but I think that if you're a little bit uncomfortable mixing it up, then I would just suggest using one. On the flop, I definitely suggest using one sizing, but on the turn, and especially the river, we can make our strategy more complicated because our range is tighter, so it's more easy to manage our frequencies. Let's look at one more turn card. Let's say a 10. Now on the 10, it also makes sense to be leading out a bit more thinly because again, we have a lot more medium strength hands. We have lots of hands like a 10, which are decent, but not great. So you want to find a bet size that fits a decent hand. And a small bet size in a large-ish pot, that makes a lot of sense. Just because I can't help myself, let's pick the king, and you'll see the same thing as on the ace. We're leading out at a very low frequency, even less than on the ace, which is interesting. And when we lead out big. So back to Jack 8-6 flush draw here. In position checks back, which he can do around 30% of the time if you want to copy the exact strategy. So what do we do on the 3? You see that out of position. So what do we do on the 3? You see that out of position leads out for a large sizing with a somewhat polarized range. Because if in position still checks back a bunch of pretty decent hands, you want to just bet polarized. Where if the card is more scary, then you may want to lead out a bit smaller. So which hands do we lead? You see again that most of our nutted hands get led, 8s and 6s. But again, we mix it up sometimes in order to not get exploited by imposition when he delay c-bets. You'll see that most top pairs get led because they're a little bit too weak to be check raising, but at the same time, they are a little bit too strong to be check calling. So we mix it up sometimes, but we still check some. But we also do check sometimes. The reason it leads out so often is because some of them have a flush draw as well. So if this were a rainbow board, you would see hands like King Jack being led much less frequently. But because we only have 3 combos of King Jack and one of them has the second nut flush draw as well, we tend to lead more often. So you see right here, King Jack of spades and King Jack of clubs only get led around 38% of the time. You'll see that a hand like ace-5 hearts with the nut flush draw gets led out most of the time. In fact, almost always. But a hand like ace-queen of hearts gets checked very often because we beat almost every hand in imposition's range that is not a pair. And our queen is a nice out when we do check call. You could bet a hand like this and overbluff a little if you think that imposition has a weak check back range and he'll therefore overfold. Or if you think he's a massive calling station, so when you do hit, you get extra value because he'll just keep looking you up with hands like an 8. Other than that, the board gets played in a somewhat straightforward manner. You'll see that medium strength hands like 7s and an 8 get checked most of the time, as well as 10s and 9s. And we're leading sometimes with the mergier hands, but then check with the medium strength hands. And you'll see that strong draws get led very often, like for instance ace-5 of hearts, but then weaker draws don't get led nearly as often. So for instance, queen-9 of spades, which is only a gut shot with no flush draw, we tend to just check. But of course you want to mix it up, because when the best bluffs all get there on the river, of course you still want to have bluffs. So what about check raising? So back to the check raise, we let imposition bet half pot and we check raise. This is not a board on which you want to check raise too small because imposition has a lot of high equity draws. So we check raise and imposition fast plays quite often for protection as well. But this time he calls. You'll see that on a 3, which makes the board more wet, but is not a scary card necessarily, not right now, you'll see that we fast play for a pot size bet shove very, very often, because we're representing a polarized range now, and that range wants to get as much value as possible as well as protection. So the main difference here with the a7-3 board is the presence of all the draws. On a7-3, if you have 7s, no turn card is that scary, so you can just bet smaller and then still jam basically any river. Whereas here, if you have a hand like pocket 8s, there's many rivers that hurt your hand where you'll just have to end up closing your eyes and shove, and then you'll get snap called by the nuts fairly frequently, because imposition has a lot of high equity hands in his range. On a7-3, they really don't unless they have specifically aces. So basically, fast play a lot on the wet boards with a polarized range. You see, we're checking 28% of the time. And then slow play more often, or just bet smaller on the dry boards like a7-3. And you'll see that we check raise mostly with our stronger draws, like for instance, ace-5 of hearts, or a hand like 5-4 of hearts sometimes. So now you're going to be thinking, hey, you just told me that on the turn, you don't really want to get it in with dominated draws, which is true. The main reason why it bets a hand like 5-4 of hearts, basically always, but not a hand like 10-9 of hearts, is because 5-4 of hearts will be unblocking tons of air in imposition's range. Whereas with 10-9 of hearts, you unblock almost all of imposition's air, which means he's more likely to be calling. And then we mostly fast play again with our good hands, 8s and 6s. They are really good hands because not only do they have a set, but they also unblock all the strong hands that imposition may call with. And then we are mostly checking with our medium strength jacks because they're mostly ahead on the turn, but once imposition calls, we're doing quite poorly. And then some of our check raises that didn't improve in equity, we just give up. So if we did check raise and like queen-9 of spades, you'll see we're never really shoving that. So that would be a bit of a suicide bluff. So what about a more scary card? So on the 10 of hearts, in position can easily have a flush, pocket tens, or just, you know, good hands like nines plus heart or aces plus heart, etc. So you see that we are still betting often, actually very often, but we're now betting small. So the first example was a dry board in which you want to bet small. The last example was a wet board in which you want to fast play. But when draws get there, you don't really want to fast play. See? You want to just bet small. So we're almost never shoving. So when draws get there, make it a 3-street game. And then you'll see again that most of the strong hands just get bet. We're betting at a high frequency, so there's no real hands you want to be checking here, other than maybe a medium strength hand sometimes. So it is pretty surprising how aggressive out of position is here. If we pick the 3 of hearts, this strategy is a bit more intuitive, because the 3 at least doesn't change anything. It doesn't give in position Jack 10 as well as pocket 10s as high equity hands. But we're still betting small. Last but not least, the river. I'm going to cover what to do when facing a river all in, which hands to be calling, which hands to be folding. Generally, you want to look at 2 things. You want to look at your hand strength. So obviously, the better our hand, the more often we want to call. And you want to look at your blockers. So the last bullet point. Sometimes a hand which is not that strong in terms of absolute value may remove a lot of villain's value hands, whereas some of your stronger hands may remove some of your opponent's bluffs. Obviously, you don't want to be calling with tons of really bad hands with blockers, because then if villain shoves a pretty good hand, you'll look stupid. When we check raise and bet the turn, we go all in with a polarized range, because villain has bet called and a 3-bet pot and then called the turn, so he's got a strong range. So if we're saying we want to value bet, it means we're very, very polarized. But that's on a safe card. So if we check raise a7-3, we can keep on barreling pocket 7s on a clean runout. But on the jack 8-6, if the river is, let's say, the 10 of hearts, we cannot just blindly value jam a hand like ace-jack or even a hand like pocket 6s. Villain is going to check back lots of turns, so we can probe the river. We can either probe small, the block bet, or we can probe big. So the bet size you'll be using is in line with the range you'll be betting. So if you bet really small, a block bet, obviously you're representing very thin hands for value, whereas if you bet 3/4 pot or even all in, you're representing an extremely polarized range. When potentially calling off your stack, think about your range. So I mentioned the importance of hand strength as well as blockers, but also look at your frequencies. So if the majority of your range on the turn is top pair when you call, if you just say, well, in the river I have top pair, I call, it means we're basically always calling. So you have to look at how your kicker potentially blocks value hands or bluffs, and whether or not you potentially beat weaker value bets. So let's get into that with Pile Solver. So on a7-3, turn 8, we saw that villain prefers a large bet, and we don't fast play much because the board is so dry and it's so bad for us. So we call, and let's pick a really bad card first, a king. We check, obviously, and you see that in position value bets very aggressively, because, I mean, ace-king just got even better. Hands like ace-queen are still looking good. So in position bets. So which hands are we calling? You'll see that our occasional slow plays like pocket 8s obviously get called, as well as 8-7. Hands like ace-queen get called because in position potentially value bets the same hand. So we cannot fold a hand which both beats bluffs, is very good, and potentially splits. And then what about the rest of our range, which is mostly an ace? So you see that if we're calling all of our aces as well, we're calling almost our entire range other than the very weakest 7x. 7x does tend to get folded because we have such weak hand strength, although its removal effects are somewhat okay. Because if you were to have a hand like 7-6, you'll be removing bluffs like 10-9, Jack-10, etc. But you cannot just get into the habit of check calling your stack off with 4th pair here. Your hand strength is just too weak. So you see right here, don't just call any low pair just because you unblock bluffs. That is not a good way of looking at the situation. So here we are calling a hand like ace-4, which makes sense, unblocking bluffs as well as having a good hand, an ace. And then you see that hands like ace-9 mostly get folded because we block hands like 10-9 that are going to bluff. Obviously, we have some nut flush draws that get folded as well. For instance, king-queen of clubs, because they block some bluffs as well. So we're calling at a decent frequency here, folding around 60% of the time. Now, let's make the river a bit more safe for imposition. On the jack, you'll see we have a few leads, but I would just ignore those. I think it's too difficult to set up a strategy where you also have all-in leads, at least on a card like this. Maybe on some other cards you could have leads. Imposition and bets aggressively. And we are calling at a similar frequency. So you see right here, we're calling first based on hand strength again, 8s, ace-jack, etc. Ace-10 now gets called more often because we block 10-9. And then you see here now ace-5 and ace-4 get folded because now, they don't unblock draws that missed. Because now the jack completes hands like jack-10 that imposition will just be checking behind. And obviously 10-9 actually has the nuts now. Ace-9 now also goes up in value for the same reason that we block 10-9. And then we're obviously again folding with hands like 7. And you see with hand like pocket 10s, don't put on the tinfoil hat. Your hand is just not strong enough to be calling with. You can call hands like ace-10 first. So I understand why you would be calling with 10s here, but if you're just calling every type of hand with some blockers, then you're just way overdoing it, and then you're just calling way too often. And once again, we're folding the missed flush draws. Let's pick a scary card then. The 6 of clubs. This is a card that imposition does not want to see. So it makes sense that imposition may include some smaller bets now and it checks back more often. Obviously, because the card is worse than the king or the jack. So let's just be aggressive and jam. And you'll see that we're now calling a little bit more often. And you think, well, why are we only calling 5 percentage points more? And the reason is that imposition has a way tighter range to begin with. So if imposition were to shove the same frequency as on the king, then we would call far more often. So here we have all of the aces with the nut flush, we're calling them. So you see now that hands like ace-jack are much weaker because we block jack-10 now and we don't block any clubs unless we have the nuts. So the card is a little bit better for us, which means imposition is less aggressive. Obviously, we're still calling a little bit more because we actually have more good hands, but we're still folding most of the weaker ones. You see that hands like ace-queen that were getting called basically always now sometimes get folded. And obviously, we're calling more often if we have the ace of clubs because now we're removing some more value hands. Whereas if we don't have a club, we're always folding. And then if we have the queen of clubs, it's kind of close. So here you have to mostly look at your opponent and think, well, is he more the type to have a wider range or a tighter range? So the EV difference there is very minimal. Let's go into river probes. In position, checks behind on the turn, and we get a safe river. On a safe river, we're betting quite often. You see, we're block betting at a decent frequency, and we're sometimes betting bigger. There's not that many all-ins in our range because Which hand do you really want to bet all in with? 5-4 suited might make some sense, but really that's about it, because we don't have deuces, we don't have pocket aces, let's say. You'll see that we're mostly betting with our stronger aces as well, but not always. We're mixing it up and checking sometimes, so that when we do check, we have hands to be calling with. And we're mostly checking with weaker aces like ace 4. And then obviously we're checking with our medium strength hands as well, like 10s and 9s. So we're betting mostly for the smaller size because we're repping medium strength hands. It's also not easy to find that many bluffs. You see, we're turning a hand like pocket 5s into a bluff sometimes, or a hand like king queen suited, but there's not that many weaker hands. We'll have hands like jack 10, but you see we have them at a below 10% frequency to start with. So those are not hands I'm too concerned about. On a worse card like a king, we have to be more careful. That makes sense. On a good card, we are somewhat aggressive, but on a bad card, we are somewhat passive. So you see we're now betting big less often because ace king is a hand that we have to be worried about in imposition shoes, as well as some hands like king queen that are not great but decent. So we're checking more often and we're betting smaller because we have even fewer nuts in our range now. On a scary card, for both players, we also bet small. So you see right here, we have some nut flushes, but the problem is we block top pair, which we're looking to get called by. And other than that, we don't have too many strong hands, other than, let's say, like ace jack, which again blocks villain's calling range. A really nice hand here is 6-7 of clubs, for instance, because we have a flush and we unblock villain's calling range. And you'll see once again that the medium strength hands, 10s and 9s, tend to just get checked down. Those are hands that you could even turn into a check raise bluff because you'll be blocking some flushes if you have 10s with a club or 9s with a club, and you'll be blocking a river straight. That's a nice play that you should be using sometimes so that villain cannot just make thin value bets on the river and not have to worry about bet folding or making a tough bet call. So we covered river probing on the a7-3. Let's look into check raising and then betting the turn as well as the river. So we check raise the flop and got called. Turn is the 9. So you see we're betting at a pretty high frequency because the turn card is safe. And the pot is already so big we don't have to bet huge. So we choose to bet small. And you see that in position fast plays quite a bit because the board is somewhat draw heavy. But in position calls. And you'll see similar trends. You'll see that on the safer cards, we're actually betting almost our entire range. So we can choose to go for block bets as well as large bets. The reason Pi is still block bets is because we check raise some of our medium strength hands and then bet the turn. And those hands may not be worth quite an all in, but they're still worth a bet. So on the safe card, you'll see that we're betting often. If we pick a 3, you'll see we're betting often as well, but then mostly for the larger sizing. So if we pick a king, which is slightly less safe, you'll see that we start betting a little bit less often, and we also size down because the king is not the best card for us. Although it is not a horrible card because ace king is now less likely. Pocket kings now beats us, but pocket kings is a hand that he should not have on the river too often. So it's not a good card, but it's really not a terrible card. If villain had kings every single time, then we'd be in much more trouble. So there's basically no card other than a very scary card like the Queen of Clubs, let's say, where we would do a decent amount of checking. Because in position you can have all the suited aces that have a flush now, some 7x plus clubs, maybe some hands like Jack 10 of clubs occasionally. Obviously, that's a very rare combo to have. So on any clean card, we just mostly go all in. We can occasionally block bet. And we bet smaller on the scary cards. So now that we've covered different types of runouts, which hands are we value betting as well as bluffing? you'll see that we're fast playing our better aces like ace queen, but then our weaker aces like ace 10, we tend to check. Ace 9 we fast play because it's two pair, and the weaker aces, ace 5 and ace 4, we already checked on the turn. And then we can bluff with our few air hands. We don't have many, so we have hands like 6-5, let's say. We have an occasional missed flush draw like queen jack of clubs, but we don't have that much air. But that's fine, because we also don't have that many bluffs. So, and if you have a tight value range, you also don't need that many bluffs. So in a single raise pot, you could have all the missed gut shots, open-enders, flush draws, etc., and then you could be significantly over bluffing. But you don't have those in a 3-bet pot out of position, so you're not necessarily over bluffing if you only have these couple of bluffs. And you'll see that the bigger flush draws and the big cards tend to be checked down, because you'll be blocking some of your opponent's auto folds, let's say big flush draws. What about the queen? What are we betting here? You'll see we're still value betting with a hand like top 2, but a hand like ace jack is just way too weak to be betting now. So we're only betting if we have the nut flush, and even that we're checking sometimes. So you see here we're bluffing some of the lower cards occasionally, but not that often. So a hand like 6-7 we can turn into a bluff with our blockers, and we can bluff a hand like 5-4 sometimes. But again, so you'll see that our bluffing range is pretty tight, but our value range is also tight, so we can still be balanced. So if we shove all in here for around the size of the pot, our opponent needs to win around 1/3 of the time. A little bit more often because we bet slightly over pot. Now, back to King Jack 4. Which hands are we calling down on the river here? So I picked right about the safest possible run out you can get with King Jack 4, 5 deuce. So you'll see that because a king is not threatened by any of the turn or river cards, we can still bet aggressively, and we can bet very large. So you see here, we're betting all in with every single king actually. So you see right here that we only have king 9 a few percent of the time. That's because we mostly check back the turn, because we want to have some kings to check back in position shoes. But when we do have hands like king 9 or king 10, we are going all in. So since in position is betting aggressively, how do we respond? We're folding around 60% of the time. We've seen that number before. So what are we calling down on the river? You'll see that with a king, we're obviously calling down because we are near the top of our range. If we fold a king here, we're just very, very exploitable. And then we're calling down with some of our jacks. So you see mostly the jacks that unblock bluffs. So with ace jack, you block aces, you block jacks, you block ace king. You unblock hands like queen 10 and 10-9 that may be bluffing. And then we're folding, obviously, with the weaker stuff, our draws that missed, and some of our hands like an ace 5 suited type of hand. That hand may look good to be calling with occasionally, but be careful to not call down with any hand that has decent blocker value. So it makes sense that we're not calling an insane amount because in position is just doing so well. So what about river probing? In position checks back on the 5, and we pick the same clean card in the deuce. And you'll see we're betting quite often because we have a lot of value bets in this spot because our kings are not threatened, our jacks are even looking pretty good. And obviously we also have quite a few bluffs at this point. So we're doing a mixture of big betting as well as small betting. Now you don't have to use all 3 sizes if you don't want. You can just stick to 2. In this spot, simplifying to 1 sizing probably doesn't really work. It leaves too much EV on the table. So you see similar tendencies. We're betting with most kings, but not all of them. We're checking sometimes for deception. So when in position stabs, we don't just always check fold. So we are probing mostly with our better kings and then checking the weaker ones. We're betting mostly with our better jacks, and then we're sometimes checking. You see queen, jack, jack 10. But since this board is so clean, we can bet much more often. Now, if you pick a scary card like the 9 of hearts, You'll see again, we size down just on the queen of clubs in the ace 7-3 example, and we bet much less often. So we're betting a little bit less of everything. We can check a flush sometimes in order to check raise. So you see that, for instance, a hand like ace 9 of hearts gets bet. So you'll see that we're occasionally slow playing a flush as well. For instance, queen 10 of hearts, we're still checking around 27% of the time. Mostly when you check a flush, you just want to check your weaker flushes or kind of the super nut flushes. The flushes that kind of block his entire calling range. But we don't have too many of those here. So you'll see that on ace 7-3 and king jack 4, our tendencies are very, very similar. Now, on 5-6-7, it's going to be a little bit different. It went check on the flop, and we overbet the ace turn with a polarized range. As you saw earlier, we're mostly doing that with our strongest hands and our strongest draws, and some mergy hands with blockers. Obviously, imposition doesn't have to raise much because we're repping such a polarized range. And then on a clean card like a deuce, you see we're shoving often, because if we're saying that we have the nuts on the turn, why would we not shove on a deuce, which changes absolutely nothing? So we go all in with almost all of our good hands, but we sometimes check in order to protect our range and be able to check raise against river stabs, because we don't want to just check every single time, wave the white flag, and then he can bet small with a hand like ace queen, and then we don't know what to do. Or we have only weak hands that are put in a tough decision. And you'll see that we're bluffing sometimes with hands that have good blockers to the nuts. So a hand like 10-9 suited gets bluffed, especially when we have no hearts, because if we have hearts, we'll block hands like, king 10 of hearts that our opponent is going to auto fold. So if we have 10 on a spade, let's say, we block 10-9 suited and no hearts. And then you'll see that the bigger stuff, the bigger flush draws like king jack of hearts, also get checked, because we again block impositions auto folds with that hand, and we even have a tiny bit of showdown value. Although, to be fair, most villains are good enough to turn a hand like 10-9 of hearts into a bluff on the river in imposition shoes, and then obviously we cannot check call with king high, but I guess it's something. So this was the clean card, the deuce. To be fair, there's not that many clean cards on this run out, because any 3, 4, 6, 7, 8, 9 or heart really changes the board. A king can change the board a little bit as well, because ace king now beats 6-7 as well as 6-5 and ace-5. So if you pick a very scary card like the king of hearts, you'll see it does the same thing again. So we're betting at a somewhat high frequency, but we're mostly betting for the small sizing. We should still shove all in sometimes because we have a decent amount of flushes. We definitely have a flush advantage compared to our opponent. And then you see that mostly our better hands get bet, and then the medium strength hands either get checked or they get block bet. So when you bet small, make sure to incorporate mostly weaker hands, but also add in a few stronger hands, so that when you block bet, imposition cannot just raise, and then you always end up with a hand like sixes and you don't know what to do. So mixing it up here is key. But obviously your smaller bet size should be weaker than your larger bet size. In the last example, Jack 8-6, I again selected a runout which is very favorable for imposition because it doesn't change the board. Imposition only bets all in. We see that a jack is looking really good here because everything but 5-4 missed. So we are also calling a little bit more often. Imposition bets often, and we respond by calling a bit more often. So you see here that any jack is basically a call. Imposition is still going to be value betting a decent jack very, very often. So obviously we're not folding a hand which is near the top of our range. It could win, it could split, and if we're folding that hand, we are almost never calling. And then we're mostly calling with hands that have good blockers to his value hands and hands that remove his bluffs. So hands like pocket 10s and pocket 9s are always being folded, because we block hands like Queen 10. We block hands like 10-9. We block hands like 9-7, which are not in the ranges I entered, but some villains may have them. So you see, again, we're calling mostly on hand strength and then on our blockers. And then obviously we're folding with our, let's say, nut flush draws that may have ace high, but they also block some of villain's bluffs. So what about the turn probe? In position checked back on the 3 and the river's a deuce. So we see on the clean card, a jack is again looking very good, as well as even hands like pocket 10s, pocket 9s. So we're betting at a high frequency. And you see that we're betting larger somewhat often, just because a jack is worth that large bet. Even a hand like 10s, pocket 10s is the best hand here almost every single time. So when we decide to mix it up, we're mostly doing it with another hand like pocket 6s. Because with 6s, we'll be unblocking all of our opponent's bluffs and all of his value bets that bet, and then we can check raise against them. The same goes for a hand like 5-4. Now with a hand like a jack, you generally want to just bet yourself. Your hand is a little bit too weak to check raise all in. At the same time, it's a little bit too strong to check. That is on a clean card. On a scary card, you'll see, again, we're mostly using the smaller size as well as a couple of big bets, because we are punishing the fact that we have more flushes than villain, because villain would have likely bet a flush draw on the turn. And then again, you see that mostly the lower stuff gets bluffed. When you bluff for the bigger sizing, you generally want to have blockers to your opponent's calling range. So if you have a hand like, let's say, ace queen with the heart, you see right here on the bottom right, we're bluffing very often. So ace queen with the ace of hearts, queen of diamonds gets shoved all in every single time. A slightly worse queen, like ace queen with the ace of hearts and queen of spades, still gets bet somewhat often. But then a hand with no heart at all gets checked down every time. A hand like 10-9, you may want to bet but not shove, because when you have 10-9 of spades, you'll be blocking hands like 10s and 9s that your opponent is going to fold anyway against that sizing. So you prefer to just bet small, because now against third pot he may call. So you block his potential calls. I know this is a lot to take in for one video, so make sure to rewatch it a few times and make notes. And once you've spotted those patterns, you can draw conclusions and incorporate them into your game. To finish the video, I'll give you guys a good tip. If you're unsure, think about the big blind play out of position. So at the beginning of the video, I said that all positions are played the same. I showed you a hand example where blind versus blind in 3-bet pot, we c-bet a7-3 the same as button cutoff, which means that as out of position, that's the topic of the video, we're using the same response, a higher frequency check raise and a lower frequency call. If you compare all of these different scenarios we went over, you'll see that all of them get played exactly the same if you change the positions. So ranges change, but concepts don't. So make sure to think about your big blind play out of position, because that position is most accurate. I know it's difficult to play your hand out of position without the initiative when your range is behind. So it's all about pot control and minimizing damage, and not letting your opponents realize too much equity by just giving them free turns and rivers with small bets. That's the end of the video. I hope you all learned something. This was MMA Sherdog for the Bluff the Spot High Stakes course. Good luck at the tables.